Let me first welcome everybody to today's talk. The topic of today's talk is food safety policies to protect global public health, challenges to enforcement and motivations for compliance. So this is difficult to enforce a policy and motivate people to comply. So this is the second talk of a series targeting to promote agrobiotechnology and enhance agricultural productivity. We hope the series will inspire international scholars, researchers, farmers, and business in the agricultural field, as well as the interested public. I can see that there are some high school students joining today's talk. First, let me introduce our speaker, Professor May Chu. Following her study in government and public administration at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, she went to the London School of Economics and Political Science to obtain a master's degree and PhD degree in political science. After returning to Hong Kong, she worked as a senior researcher at the government's Central Policy Unit before joining the Chinese University of Hong Kong as an assistant professor now. May's main research interests center on public governance and risk regulation. Her current research focuses on the regulation of food and the environment, regulatory regimes, and the globalization of regulation, especially in the context of less developed countries and the East Asia and Pacific region. In the following presentation, she is going to introduce how food risks are regulated globally and how governments adapted their policies and food standards to accommodate the demands of food safety. Now, let's welcome Professor May Chu to the floor. Professor Chu, please.
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Professor Lam, for inviting me to this very meaningful talk. And now I see Joanna. Hello. Last time I was there to listen to your talk. Okay, let me share my screen to all of you first. So today, in my talk, I'm going to talk about the food safety policies in the world, and also in the national level, and also the local level, and see how these policies try to protect global public health, which is food safety. And I will also talk about the challenges to enforcement, because when we formulate a law, we also need the local enforcement. So what are the difficulties in enforcement, and what are the motivations for the producers to comply? So I will use some examples in China, especially because I did a lot of research there, to show you how difficult it is to make sure the food we are eating is safe. So my research is about public governance, and my focus is about risk regulation. So risks, in the modern society, there are many types of risk, such as food risk, environmental risk, and also even traffic risk. So there are so many risks. So in order to control the risks, we need policy and we need regulation. And so that's why I try to focus on how to make use of public policy to control risks. And I also focus on collaborative governance as a kind of model to control risk, because risks travel around the world, and we need some collaboration between governments and local governments to try to control risk. So these are my research interests. And I would also like to introduce my team. Actually, I worked with a research institute in Jiangnan University. So my key team member is Professor Wang Jianhua, and he is not here, but his students are here, because Professor Wang is going to Hangzhou for a conference, and I think now he is on the high-speed railway, and the Wi-Fi is not very stable, so he can't be here, but his students are here now. So Professor Wang is actually a friend of Professor Lam. And Professor Wang is a professor in the School of Business, and he's also the deputy director in the Research Institute for Food Safety Risk Administration of Jiangsu Province. So this is a key think tank and the only key think tank in Jiangsu Province focusing on food safety risk administration and research. And Professor Wang, he also have received many grants from the National Natural Science Foundation. And he's also the deputy chief of Liangxi district of Wuxi city. So he's also a government official now. So he has a lot of experience and network in doing research in China. And because of the key think tanks, we are able to collect data, and we try to use our data and then to formulate policies. And we actually have some policy impacts and social impacts because our policy recommendations have been adopted by the government. So we try to make use of these research data to formulate something which is practical. So every year, the Research Institute conducts fieldwork in different agricultural provinces in China. So we collect our survey data from both farmers and also consumers. So we target on rice, wheat, and pork. So three types of products of the producers. And then we generate some policy recommendations. So to start with, I want to share a very short story with all of you. So when I did 10 years ago, okay, when I did my PhD, I stayed in China to conduct my fieldwork. And here, this is the place that I was living in when I was in China, and this is Shenzhen city, and this is Longgang district. Okay, so in the arrow here, this is the home that I stayed when I did my fieldwork. So here, the other part, which is the Pinghu, and this is the district that I collect data. So I stayed in a government agency. So every day I have to travel from my home to my office. So you can see the red line, right? The red line actually is the border of Shenzhen. So the southern part is Shenzhen, and the northern part is Dongguan, is another city in Guangdong province. So every day when I travel from my home to my workplace, you see I have to cross the border one time and go here up, and second time. Oh, sorry. And second time, right? So I have to cross the border twice. There was a very funny observation, but that observation was actually quite annoying. So I saw many illegal taxi and private hire vehicles, especially the motorcycles there, running business in the areas, in these areas. So like in this picture. So there were actually quite many enforcement activities performed by the traffic police, but the illegal behaviors never ended. Why? Because, for example, the illegal motorcycle was here, and when he saw the Shenzhen police here, and they will immediately drive to the other side of the border. So they went to Guangdong, Dongguan, to another city. So the Shenzhen police cannot enforce in Dongguan. So they can just stay there and see the illegal travel, the illegal motorbike went away. Again, here, this is the Dongguan side. Again, the vehicles were here, and when they saw the Dongguan police coming, they will immediately cross the border and go back to Shenzhen. So they cannot enforce. So you can see risks can travel, and the problem can travel. So you may think, okay, the solution is that both governments need to collaborate to address the policy problem. So this is our very intuitive answer. They have to collaborate, but actually it's not that easy. Everything is not that easy. So I tried to use 10 years to understand what happened there. This is very similar to food safety. So the same as illegal taxi, food risks also travel. And there are so many jurisdictional problem as well. And food producers, because of the international trade, so the food risks and the producers and also the investments, they also travel from one country to another country. So you look at this graph, you can see actually the international trade activities. There's so many activities there. So having a jurisdictional problem, so we need international cooperation, intergovernmental collaboration. We also need industry coordination. So this is a very complicated process because we have to build a framework to make sure that different countries, they agree on a certain regulation and they're willing to comply with it, and they are willing to transfer their national laws to comply with the international agreements. So this is a very difficult and very challenging mechanism. So based on these statistics, you can see the activities of food trade. So the top 10 exporters and importers in the world. So in 2019, the value of export is $1,100 billion for the top 10 exporters, and also nearly $1,100 million for all the importers. So you can see a lot of activities in international trade, food trade. So how to manage the food risks? So food safety risks become a global problem now. It is quite different from in the past, because in the past, with free trade, international trade, so when one country, they can control their producers in their hometown, so they can control the food risk. But now we need a macro mechanism to control food risk. So what are the type of food safety risks? So the first one is insufficient safe food. So the access to sufficient amounts of safe food with nutrition is key to sustaining life and promoting good health. But now we don't have sufficient safe food, and in some countries, they have the problem of hunger. So second, unsafe food containing harmful bacteria, virus, parasites, and chemical substances. These can all cause more than 200 kinds of diseases, like cancer, stomach pain, so many kinds of diseases. So food safety, nutrition, and food security, they are interrelated. So unsafe food creates a vicious cycle of disease and malnutrition, particularly affecting the young children, infants, elderly, and the sick. So these are the disadvantaged groups. So children under 5 years old, they carry 40% of the foodborne disease burden. So lots of deaths every year. So an estimated 600 million fall ill after eating contaminated food. And 420,000 people die every year. So children, they are the disadvantaged group, and of course the elderly and the sick. But not many countries, they are able to cope with this health burden. So food safety risks, they also impose some social and economic impacts, because they will give harm to the socio-economic development by straining healthcare systems and also harming the national economies, tourism, and trade, just like the recent COVID-19, very similar. And food supply, just like what we talked about that just now. So food supply chains now cross multiple national borders, and good collaboration between governments, producers, and consumers can help ensure food safety. But this is very, very difficult. So you see, food safety risk is a global problem that we need to think about how to deal with. So one of the solutions is regulation. How to solve this food safety problem? Then regulation. So it seems like quite simple. So we first need to create regulations, and we also need to monitor the compliance, because we are not quite sure about whether the industry, they comply with the regulation. So we need to monitor the situation, And finally, we have to enforce the regulations. So in case we find someone who breach the law, and we have to enforce the regulations and give them some sanctions or penalties. So I will go through this process here. So first, we create regulations. So what's regulations as a policy solution? So regulations means we set some market conditions, such as price controls, market entry conditions, product requirements, and social obligations. So we set some conditions. And this is our goal. We have to attain a certain goal. Like here, we want to make sure that our food is safe. So regulation also apply on environment. So we have the environmental control, safety conditions, such as a workplace safety condition. We also have regulation on advertising or on labeling, just like what we buy. So we have the label. So these are the regulations, many types of regulations. So to control food waste, we have different forms of regulations, not just one single form. We have different forms. So the first one is the global regulation. So we have to set some higher level global regulation. For example, by WTO, because it promotes free trade. But to promote free trade, we also need some regulation about how. Okay, so the second level is state regulation. So this is the national regulation. And finally, there's another form, which is the self-regulation. Sometimes we actually do not need to rely on the government. Instead, the industry, they can regulate themselves. So the industry association, they will try to regulate their members. Just like doctor, they have the association. Lawyers, they also have their own association, and they impose some code of practice on their members. So this is a type of self-regulation. So first, the global regulation. So it is the basis for bilateral or multilateral trade agreements between countries. So about food safety regulation and the global one, there are mainly two. So the first one is CODEX. So CODEX is under FAO and WTO. And CODEX has 189 CODEX members, and they are all country members. So another set of standard is made by ISO. So ISO is an independent and international NGOs. Okay, they are NGOs. They are not government organizations. They are international NGOs for standardization. And there are 165 national standards bodies as their members. So here you see the two organizations. So for CODEX, the aim is to protect consumer health and to ensure fair practices in the food trade. So fair practices, what does it mean? Like to make sure that no country can use food safety, for example, food safety standard as a barrier to international trade. So the CODEX, they make a standard that all the members or country members, they have to follow. So country A cannot make a very stringent standard that make all other members that cannot fulfill, and so to impede trade. So it's not possible because they promote fair trade and fair practices. So every country, they have to follow the same set of standards. So the CODEX, the standard, they cover all the principal foods, processed food, semi-processed food, or raw food, from distribution to the consumer. And they cover food hygiene, food additives, residues of pesticides, drugs, contaminants, labeling, and methods of analysis and sampling, and import and export inspection, and also certification. So they make all the very detailed requirements for food trade. But bear in mind here, the nature of CODEX standard is that it's not a substitute for or alternative to national legislation, which means all countries, okay, they are members of WTO, FAO, okay? So they have to translate the global regulation from CODEX to their national law. So codex, they're impossible to have any enforcement in any country. So the international organization, they cannot enforce the law locally. So actually, the national government, they are the enforcer, but they have to first turn the global regulation into national legislation first, and then they enforce. So you can see there could be a gap. So you can imagine there would be a gap. So if you are a country and then global regulation impose some harm to your country, to the interest of your country, so you may not fully translate the global regulation to your own country. You will just try to think about which area that you can just not to comply with the global regulation in order to serve your own interest, your national interest. So CODAS standards are based on sound science provided by independent international risk assessment bodies. So this is based on science, but some members are more active than the others. So the very strong state or nations, they are more active and they have voice out and they are more powerful in WTO and WHO. So actually they are not in the equal stance. This is about international relations. So let's turn to ISO here. So you can think of ISO standards as a formula that describes the best way of doing something. So you could be about making a product, managing a process, delivering a service, or supplying materials. So the standards can cover a huge range of activity. So they try to set standard or develop standard based on the principle of voluntary, consensus-based, and market relevant. So this is their emphasis, consensus-based. So they try to make sure that every country can voice out and they have equal stance by voting. So the ISO 9001 family is the world's most well-known quality management standard for companies and organizations. So ISO 9001. So related to food, there are more than 1,600 standards, ISO standard related to the food sector. So the standard is made by voting. So there are three types of categories of members in ISO. So the first one is the member body, and the first one is the correspondence member, and the third one is a scribe member. So each type of member, they enjoy different levels of access and influence over the ISO. So the standard setting bodies of a country, they actually become the member of ISO. So you and me cannot be the member of ISO, but it should be the government standard organization in the country, so they can become the member. So every country can only have one member to represent them in ISO. So the different type of categories can actually determine the influence of the country. So here you see there are different levels of influence for different countries. Like France, they participate in more than 700 technical committee and 5 policy development committee. And China is also very powerful in ISO, and they have 740 technical committee and 5 policy development committee as well. We invite 92 participation in the technical committee. So you can see different countries impose different influence and ISO. So you can imagine, so the standards, are they only sometimes based on science, just pure science, but sometimes no, because some members, they're more powerful. So in the consensus-based process of decision making, they try to influence the final decision more. So actually different countries have different levels of influence. But the ISO is very proactive in standard setting. Just like in 2008, there was a milk scandal in China, the melamine and the milk example, that the infant formula in China was contaminated with melamine, so resulting in several deaths and thousands of babies, they stay in the hospital. So during that time, ISO and the International Dairy Federation, they put together the technical specification on milk and milk products immediately, and they set guidelines. So ISO standards are market driven. So when they see there's a niche there, so they have to fill the gap. So that's why it's very like commercial based organization. But it doesn't mean global standards, there's no dispute. Actually, there are a lot of disputes for the international standards because your own country, your national interests can be harmed under the new standard. So this is a very recent example just this week. So here, two pictures, you can see some salted fermented vegetables using cabbage. So in Korea, we call it kimchi, a spicy one. And this one in China, we call it pao tai. So it's also both they're made of cabbage. So the method is very similar. So they put salt and also some chili, and then it is the final product. So there are many types of kimchi, spicy pickle dish, using cabbage. So earlier this month, the ISO published new rules for the development, transportation, and storage of pao tai. Okay, China, they use the name pao tai. And the rules on the standards are actually made by the Sichuan province in China, where the majority of pao tai is produced in Sichuan. And they had lobbied for the certification. And then the final new rules was announced earlier this month. The official Chinese media claimed that, okay, this international standard can also have the impact of kimchi. In other words, kimchi in Korea may not be able to meet the requirements made by ISO, which is dominated by Sichuan province in China. So there could be some possible impact on kimchi. So this is the dispute, and the South Korea governments they oppose the idea, and the media they also report that it is impossible. Because we have the long history of kimchi, you cannot suddenly make a standard, but not serving their own interest. So they prompt some anger on social media and also the government. So finally, the government of South Korea, they released a statement saying that international standards for kimchi cannot follow ISO, but follow the UN, so which is the coldest one. So you can see international standards to making can actually have a lot of interest there that people would negotiate and lobby in order to make sure that the final decision can serve their own interest. So this is quite complicated in the international world. So now we turn to the next level, which is about the state's regulation. So just now I mentioned, so the global regulation, they have to translate into state regulation nationally in order to make sure that there are some enforcers to enforce the law. So for a state regulation, normally we have three very important elements to construct a regulatory regime which is effective. So the first one is the standard setting. So we have to set the standard and set the regulatory goals through the standards and targets. Second, we need the monitoring. So we have to collect the information about the status quo of the controlled policy issues or the problem areas and their relevant changes. So we want to know the status quo because the situation can become better or become worse. So we have to monitor the situation to see what policy response that we have to make. So finally, we have the behavior modification, which means when you find out that someone did not comply with the law, so you have to make sure that you have to adjust their individual and organizational behavior or the wrongdoing, and to ensure that the regulatory standards are met and the overall regulatory goals are attained. So we need all the three elements. So either one element is not working or working effectively, so the regulatory regime cannot work. So first, standard setting in China. So here is a comparison between the two sectors in China. So the domestic market and the food export market in China. So this is a very interesting observation in China. So both markets are actually being regulated by different laws, different standards, and different regulations, which is quite different from other countries. So for many other countries, especially the well-developed countries, they just have one set of national standards. But in China, there are two sets. So the export market, so for the food going out for exportation, they have to comply this set of law. And for the food, which is circulating inside the domestic Chinese market, they have to comply with another law, another set of law. So first, the food export market, so they have to comply with Codex and ISO standards. So after China's WTO entry in 2008, there have been deeper integration with the international market because they have to do trade with all other countries. So they have no choice. So they have to directly adopt the international standards for their exported food. So they have to follow Codex and ISO standard, and these serve as the basis for bilateral and multilateral trade agreement between China and all other importing countries. So the process or the standards are very transparent and inclusive. So which means transparent. So you just go to ISO or Codex, you can check, okay, what standard you have to follow if you're the producer. So for the national standard, it is quite different for the domestic market. So they have the very distinctive structure of national standards. So before 2008, around before 2008, the decision-making power was monopolized by state actors and the leading enterprises. But after 2008, in the recent decade, there has been an increasingly inclusive standard setting process, and they allow negotiation between the state actors. So what does it mean? So in the past, in China, so the national food standard making was monopolized by the leading enterprises. So imagine if you are a small business, so you actually cannot comply with the very high standard made by the leading enterprises. And if you are the leading enterprises, to serve your own company interest, you will try to make a very stringent requirement, to make all the standards very stringent, very difficult to meet. Then you can kick out the small producers in the market, and then you can get a larger market share. So in the past, the state, they serve the interest of the leading enterprises. So the standards could be very high, but actually no one can achieve. But then, in the recent decade, there are more negotiations between the state actors and representatives from the large, medium, and small-sized enterprises and farms. And they also will consider the expert opinion and the scientists and industry associations. So now it becomes better. So become more transparent and more inclusive. They try to include different stakeholders in the process. So in the decision-making process. So this is the trend. And for agricultural food products in China, there are different types of standards which form a three-level hierarchy. So the three-level model of national standard was established step by step between 1992 and 2002. So this model remains effective today and includes three rankings. So the pollution-free food, green food, and organic food. So the process of making each type of food standard was partly scandal-driven and involved policy learning from the international organizations. So you see here, at the lowest requirement, so it is the pollution-free food. So here, with less stringent regulation on the use of fertilizer, pesticide, drug, heavy metals, and chemicals. And the second level is the green food, which is this type of food you can only see in China. The name is a name called green food. So it is in the middle. So they allow the use of fertilizer, pesticide, drug, chemical, but with more requirement, but with more stringent regulation. So for organic food, there's no use of the chemical, fertilizer, pesticide, drug, and all other substance. So organic food. So you can see there's a hierarchy. But a very interesting observation is that the pollution-free food, although it has the lowest requirement, it actually has just become mandatory for market entry since 2002 and become mandatory in 2006, not many years ago. So it was only 14 years ago that there are some mandatory market entry standards for China's agricultural food products. So the standards are made by the Ministry of Agriculture. Very interesting. It was the organic food and the green food, they emerged in the 1990s. So green food was first formulated in 1992 and organic food first made in 1994. So the aim is to promote rural development sustainability and food and grain security. So the concern in the 1990s in China was about grain security, whether we have enough food. Okay, so if we use the intensive agricultural model of farming, so we will lose a lot of land and a lot of resources like water resources, land resources, and will make a lot of pollution. So the government during that time, they really care about whether we have enough food to feed the huge population. So during that time, they start to think about, okay, we have to save our land. So we have to make sure that we do not exploit our land too much in order to make sure that the food, we have sustainable food and sustainable agriculture. So during that time, they formulate the green food first because they thought it's quite difficult to attain the goal of organic food. So they formulate the green food first. And then 12 years later, the organic food, they set the standards. But very interesting, it was the State Environmental Protection Administration who made the standard for organic food. It's not the Ministry of Agriculture. So you see, different government authorities, they made different types of standards in China. Again, there are quite some disputes in the standard set process and a lot of politics involved inside. So in the past, in China, they even have the local standards. They do not only have the national standards set by the central government, they also have the provincial standard, and they also have the city standard for a single product, like water. So a bottle of water. So Guangdong province can have their own standard, and Guangxi province have another standard. So the standards can be competing, and there could be conflict between the standards. In other words, so your product formulate or produced in Guangdong, of course you have to comply with the Guangdong standard. But this doesn't guarantee that your products can be sold in Guangxi because they have another set of standards. And those standards could be conflicting. So in the recent 10 years, that's why the national government, they try to coordinate. And now only the national government can formulate the standard, but not provincial government and city government. So they now lose their standard setting power now. And also in the past, between provinces or between regions, they there's the observation of race to the bottom, just like the environmental problem. So they want to attract more investment in their own jurisdiction. So they will try to make the standard lower, including food safety, including environmental standard. So with the lower standard, so the producer, they will go to your place, your jurisdiction to produce there because you are able to pollute the environment. So you do not need to follow so many standards, which is quite costly to comply. So this is the race to the bottom. So every country, every province, they will try to set lower, and you set lower and lower than you. So it is a competition, but to the bottom. So this is a very, very bad observation. And another observation is the local protectionism. So every local government, they want to protect their own business, their own producers in their jurisdiction. So they will try to be involved in the national standard decision making. They try to voice out in order to make sure that their interests are being served. So here, there's an example about the national standard setting of the Chinese sausage. So according to the two pictures, you cannot see the difference between southern China Chinese sausage or northern China Chinese sausage. Actually, it's just the same thing. Okay, as a consumer, I would say, okay, they are just the same. But actually, the standard setting procedure inside actually involves a lot of negotiation. So the composition of the committee is responsible for drafting food standards represent the interests of the leading enterprises rather than those of the medium-sized. Guangdong meat, preserved meat, is a good example. So in 2005, there was a committee of 8 members to draft the new standard for preserved meat products, including this Chinese sausage. Okay, 8 members. So among the 8 members in this committee, 2 were from the industry associations. 4 were from the leading enterprises in the northern part of China. Okay, northern part only. And there's a government official and 1 scientist. So you can see here, the business in the southern part of China and the small business were not represented on the committee. So the combination favored the business interests of the large producers in the northern part. So in the whole process, there's no consultation or not any consensus building in the standard setting process. So finally, when the proposed new standard of preserved meat products were published in 2007, sausage in the southern part of the China could not meet the requirements or the standard because of the excessive use of salt. So the salt level is too high. So they cannot meet the standard. But why? That's because of the weather. So in the southern part of China, and the northern part is very dry. So that's why the producer in the northern part, they have to put more salt for preserving the meat. But then the final outcome is that the sausage has a higher salt level, which cannot meet the national standard. So you can see standard setting is very complicated and involves a lot of political negotiation. So the final outcome is that the southern part of China, the sausage, they cannot comply with the standard, and now they cannot survive in the market. So despite their efforts to bargain with the regulatory body, the products of some producers now have to be named as local flavor sausages. So when you go to the Chinese supermarket, you can see it's the same thing, the Chinese sausage, but on the package, you can see the name, local flavor sausage, because their product actually cannot meet the national standard. Okay, so the second step, monitor the compliance. So bear in mind, monitoring and enforcement are both at the national level. So the global regulation, they cannot be translated, they cannot be enforced at the national level. They have to be translated into the national law and then being monitored and enforced. So Codex is not a substitute or alternative to national regulation. So the international organizations have no authority to enforce and implement policy. So this is the point that we have to bear in mind. So now the national governments, they have to monitor the compliance. So monitoring. So what are the tools for gathering the information about the status quo of the producers or inside the industry? So there are various information gathering tools to monitor the regulated industries. So including licensing and registration, inspection work, record keeping, and food testing. So licensing first. So licensing or registration allows the regulators to gain basic information regarding the industry, such as the number of producers in the sector, their locations, production scales, and production facilities. So for the inspection work, it enables regulators to monitor the industry and to guarantee that their compliance with the established standards. So they can also impose legal requirements on the producers to keep production record and sales record in order to enable them to understand their activities, and in case there's any food accident, they can trace the origin. So for food testing and analysis, they are the scientific ways to obtain information about food risks and the trend of changes in food safety regulation. So I will explain later how these information gathering tools are applied in different sectors. So in China, they are not applied consistently to monitor food for different markets and producers. So there are a range of variations between which type of tool is being used, but I will go into detail later. So the final step, enforce regulation. So when we observe some wrongdoing, so we have to modify the behavior of the producers. So this is the control components of the behavior modification. And there are many tools that the regulators can use. So these include some persuasive measures, such as education, leaflet, banner display, talks for knowledge transfer. And there could be some moderately deterrent measures, such as using fines, confiscation of produce, and temporary closure. And finally, there can, such as the revocation of license or closure of the business. And again, these tools of behavior modification tools are not applied consistently to monitor different producers. So there are still many variations. So among the three types, persuasion, fine, and closure, you can see the different level of aggressiveness. But we need to ask a question. Is it the more stringent type of deterrent measures, the more effective? So you will think about like more stringent, and people will be scared about that, and they will try to comply. So this is our intuition. But there have been a lot of study about the motivation. So I used a example about illegal road crossing of pedestrian as an example. So now, for example, in Hong Kong, when you cross the road illegally, so when you see the red light there, but you cross the road, there will be a penalty of $2,000. So $2,000 for many people may be okay. It could be expensive, but for the very rich people, they don't think it's any money. But for and I don't want to take the risk. So how to make sure that 2,000 is enough? Okay, so some people will say, okay, people are so rich, let's formulate another penalty. Don't make use of fines, 2,000. How about death penalty? Okay, so which means when you cross the road illegally, you will receive a death penalty. Okay, very scary, right? I won't cross the road illegally anymore because the outcome could be death. But then, here's a question. If you are the enforcer, so if you are the police, are you willing to enforce? So there are quite many studies over the world. Then the police, they may not enforce because they will consider the situation more. Okay, there will be no enforcement because they will think that, okay, just cross the road illegally, then you will kill a person if you enforce, which means you will kill a citizen. So you won't enforce. So this means the more stringent, it doesn't mean more effective. It could be very ineffective instead. So again, very similar here to farmers' illegal use of pesticide. So now in China, the illegal use of pesticide, you receive the penalty of like 1,000 RMB, or some other offenses will be more expensive. 1,000. This 1,000 can be expensive for the farmers. They are living under poverty. So are you able to enforce? So there are also spatial inequalities. So some farmers in some like more prosperous area, they are rich. 1,000 for them is nothing. But for Guizhou, the farmers there, they are very poor. So for them, 1,000 is a lot. So how could we make sure that we have the good incentive to ensure that different farmers, they comply? So you can see the limitation of regulation, the limitation of this deterrent measure. So don't drive them into a corner. If survival becomes an issue, why do they need to be a good producer? Anyway, they cannot survive. So why do they need to comply? Or they want to take the risk of overusing pesticide. At least they can plant something and they can sell in the market. So you can see it is quite difficult to make the decision about or the level about how to modify the behavior of the wrongdoing. And there are also other types of obstacles to enforcement. So the first one is the interest of the business and the government. And these are the domestic factors that lead to the enforcement gaps between the standards and the regulatory actions. So the first one, this one, the interest between the business and government is that the government have to concern the sustainable economic growth. So if they enforce, they may have to close down some producers. And that will bring about some social instability. And if they close down the producers or the large firms, so there will be unemployment problem and there will be social instability. So you have to consider these things. So the government have their own interests, and the business, the interest and the government interests are interlinked together. So this make the enforcement difficult because the government, they do not have the political commitment to enforce. And we call this thing is like regulatory capture. So the capture means that the regulator is being captured by the business. And also availability of regulatory resources. So the frequent information gathering activity could be very expensive because frequent inspection can be very costly, especially in the areas that the producers, they are just distributed in different districts, different regions. And it's very expensive and very stupid for you to travel from this place to the mountain. And inside the mountain, there's only one producer there. And to inspect that small farm. And that farm could be very small because in China, we have a lot of individual farmers. So it's impossible. And it is very cost inefficient to do so. So what can you do? So you have to invest your resources to make sure that you can gain the maximum return. So that's why the large producer and the small producer, they receive different inspection frequency. So the regulators, they have to allocate their resources based on risk sometimes. So risk-based regulation is a new idea about risk-based, which means, for example, the large producers, they produce a lot of food. So when you go there for one time of inspection, so you can collect one sample, then you can control a huge amount of food circulated in the market. But then if you go to the small farm, there's just only a small amount of produce, but you can, even you do the inspection or testing, you can just control a very small amount of produce. So the best decision is you have to go to investigate the large farm. So this is risk-based. But then this is the problem of equality. Why? Why is there some unfair treatment? So the small farm, they can cheat. So these are also the considerations. So with the obstacles of enforcement in the world, every countries, they have their own enforcement obstacles. So what are the strategies that the government can use? So for example, some developing countries, they want to have more foreign capital, and they may rely on exports for economic growth. So this country, they also do not have enough regulatory capacity in terms of resources. So they may try to invest their resources to enforce the law selectively in order to be cost effective. So they want to serve to save their international reputation. So the government may prioritize the export food which can affect their foreign relations and exportation. So China, they're actually using this strategy. And this strategy is actually quite successful that many developing countries, they also try to learn about. So the Chinese government, they use a dichotomous approach to enforcement. So resulting in different regulation and enforcement force in this domestic and export food sector. So for the export food sector, there is strong deterrence measures, and the domestic sector, the measures are reactive and rely on persuasion only. So the variation between the two sectors results from a combination of the internationalization of regulatory practice for the export food sector, and also the resources constraint and the lack of political commitment for the domestic market. So different markets, they face different sectors. They have different concerns. So the government try to use dichotomous strategy for enforcement in order to serve the interest between the two markets. So here is the findings, like the information gathering or the monitoring tools and the behavior modification tools for different markets. So first, this table, they compare the use of different tools of monitoring to gather information. So this is for the domestic market, and this is for the export market. So you can see the frequency and the rigorousness of farmland inspections for the small-scale individual farms are very low. Okay, overall is low. So the inspection is low for the small farmers. But for the export, it's very high. When I did my field work, I met quite many farmers and small producers, manufacturer food producers. They say, in my lifetime, I've never seen one inspector coming. So never seen. So for the export sector, the producer, they say, no, the inspector, they are coming every week. Okay, they do the inspection and they collect our food and for the food testing. So you can see the difference between the domestic and the export food products. So the small farmer and the food workshop, they are monitored by using a reactive approach because of their limited market share, and because their product just only circulate in the neighboring rural areas. Okay, so the small produce of the farmers, they just circulate in the surrounding area. So this food risk, they has a lower level of chances to travel to another province. Okay, only the big producer, they are more able to produce a lot of farm products, and they can be circulate in other provinces. So based on the risk-based regulation, so it is a smarter decision to regulate the large farms only. So same for food testing. There's more stringent requirement for the export food sector, but not for the small farm. Okay, so for the behavior modification tools, the same. So the consideration of business interest and government interest is very apparent when we see the decision making of the enforcement practice between the medium size and large size farms, and then the small farms. So here I have to explain a little bit. So for the large farm, normally they will face the penalty of fine, so collecting fine. But the small farm, they rarely receive fine because they are not able to pay the fine. So that's why the regulator, they will persuade the producer, to persuade or explain to them, so what you have to improve and what you have to do for this small farm. And many of these farms, they do not have the sufficient knowledge to understand the law. So persuasion is a better strategy. But for the large farm, they are more knowledgeable. So if they do not comply with the law, so their inspector normally will just impose the fine to them. But they do not use the highly deterrent measure like the closing down of the business. They do not impose this type of highly deterrent measure on them because this will hurt the GDP of the city, of the jurisdiction. So they won't close down the business even they violate the law. In my field work in China, again 10 years ago, I observed there the large factory, very large factory in China, in that city, actually in that district of that city. So that factory is so large that they actually contribute to the 40% of the employment. They hire 40% of the labor force of this district. But that factory, actually, it is a fake one. It is not the, just like, I cannot say the brand, but for example, Coca-Cola, but it's not Coca-Cola, okay? The name is Coca-Cola, okay? The factory, the name is Coca-Cola. But actually, it's not a real Coca-Cola, it's a fake one. They produce the bottle the same as Coca-Cola, but it's not the real Coca-Cola factory. The government, they knew it, but just because the factory is too big that they cannot enforce. Because if you really enforce the law, the factory closed down, so you will have a 40% of unemployment rate suddenly increase, and social instability. You cannot afford. So that's why they do not use the highly deterrent measure for enforcement. But for export to food sector, they have no choice because the Chinese government, they have to do international trade. So they have to make sure that the food they export can comply with the international standard, and they will do all kinds of enforcement. So they have the blacklist. If the factory, they cannot comply with the standard, they are not able to export. So they will just revoke the export license of the factory. So you can see different strategies, even the same law they are facing, but the government actually use different strategies for enforcement to serve the interest. So this shows how a developing country, they use a pragmatic approach to regulation to better balance the international pressure and national interests. And they adapt well by strategically shifting between regulatory convergence and divergence. So sometimes they comply with the international law, so they converge with the international law and regulation. And sometimes they diverge a bit, like, okay, this is not about trade, so this is my own country's issue, so I can just adjust. So you can see how developing countries survive in international trade. So finally, I have to talk about the self-regulation as an alternative. So actually state regulation is very expensive. So the government, they have to invest a lot of resources to formulate regulations and for enforcement. So an alternative is about self-regulation, which means an industry level organization, such as the trade association or the professional body, they formulate some laws and they enforce the laws, okay, among their members. So they will set and enforce the rules and standards relating to the conduct of the firms in the industry. So these organizations, they are just the industry level, not government level or not firm level. So firm level, which means every big country, big company, they have their own internal code of practice and standard. But this self-regulation, it actually is about the industry level organization. So the private sectors, they rely on self-regulation to address a lot of issues, such as healthcare, higher education, fashion, advertising, mining, or even like nuclear power. So many sectors, they use the self-regulatory process to govern their industry practice. So they establish the standard and develop and apply the code of practice or professional ethics to ensure the consumer evidence. So they can also monitor the compliance and enforce their rules among their members. So self-regulation, there are some benefits, but also some limitations. So first benefit, self-regulation can avoid over-regulation. What does it mean by over-regulation? Which is the unnecessary or inefficient regulation raises production costs for business, but they do not bring any corresponding benefits, and these costs are ultimately borne by the consumers. And self-regulation can avoid the over-regulation by the government. And self-regulation can be more efficient for business, and these can save the cost, the production cost, which will be passed to the consumers. And self-regulation, they are faster. So the rulemaking, monitoring, and enforcement, the process are much faster using the self-regulation rather than the government regulation, because they are quicker, more efficient. They can just very easily to adjust the standards or adjust their enforcement strategy, and the consumers therefore can be protected earlier. But for the government regulation, if you want to change a law or a legislation of the government, very complicated process. You have to pass the legislature, the voting, negotiation, which needs sometimes more than 1 year or 2 years to complete. But self-regulation is much quicker. And the self-regulation can benefit the economy by creating a more flexible regulatory environment than the than the state regulation. And this can also internalize the ethical behavior and principles, because these principles and the rules are based on social norms and the conduct of the peers. And the members, they all agree with these principles and ethical behavior, and that's why they join the association. So these norms are internalized. And of course, self-regulation can reduce the government, the government expenditure. And the taxpayer can pay less. And this can also avoid jurisdictional conflict and legal limitation. What's that? Like Coca-Cola again. Coca-Cola, they can produce their product in country A. But then country B may say, okay, you do not meet the standard in my country, and sorry, you cannot sell our products here. But for self-regulation, these multinational corporations, they just need to follow, they have to follow the industry association standard, and then they can travel. So this can avoid the jurisdictional conflict and legal limitations. And the limitation. So the limitation is that the free rider problem. So for some this type of self-regulation organization, they set the rules for their own industry, including firms that do not participate in the organization, because they regulate the whole industry. So even you are the firm, you are not a member, so you are being regulated, but you are, as this firm, you do not need to comply with, okay, sorry, I have to make it clear again. So if you are a firm and you are not a member of the organization or the association, even you break the law, then the organization cannot impose any penalty on you because you are not a member. But you can enjoy the benefits that bring to the industry because the association, they regulate the industry and the industry earn the reputation. Then you can also enjoy the benefit, but you do not need to bear the cost. So this is the free rider problem. So the bad actors who do not want to be regulated or who want to avoid the rules of the, say, a self-regulatory organization, they will just stay outside the system. I won't join, but I will enjoy the benefit. So this is the free rider problem. So some people will say self-regulation may be less effective, but it is not necessarily true, because business, they can also provide a high degree of oversight because they regularly monitor the activities of their competitors. Okay, the competitor. Imagine if you are a member, if you see your competitor not complying with the industry, the code of practice, of course, you will just tell the association, okay, look, they are not complying, you have to check. So this is a kind of oversight by the peer. So they have the incentive to report the violations. And the government, the public organization, they can also put some pressure on this self-regulatory organization to address concerns overlooked by the industry. So self-regulation can be effective in this way. So then we need an integrated approach. So now we have international regulation, state regulation, and self-regulation. But how can different level of regulation create an integrated approach to control the food risk? And which form of regulation is more effective, state regulation or self-regulation? And how the global regulation can be translated into national standard. So there's a term, we say regulatory harmonization. So the purpose of regulatory harmonization is to promote free trade. So the ultimate outcome is that the regulatory requirements or public policies of different jurisdictions become aligned. So they become the same. So they have to harmonize the rules, standards, policy objective, procedure of methodology or institutional structures. So they put a lot of method to become harmonized between different standards among different countries. So this is a lot of work for harmonization. But still, we have to think about whether actually the state regulation and self-regulation, which one is more like effective. And so how can we make sure that we can create an integrated approach? So this is a lot of debates there, a lot of study there, but we do not have a very clear answer. Then we have to think about compliance. So when we do regulation, so the next thing is that we have to think about whether the industry comply with the regulation. So in the regulatory space, there are different actors in it. And yet in this space, it is unevenly occupied by different actors with diverse interests. And the power relations and resources among them are also imbalanced. So how can you make sure that the other party agree with you? So we turn to the industry. So only regulations cannot guarantee the control of food risk. So the ultimate goal is compliance. So industry compliance, they involve different producers, including farmers, food producers, manufacturers, and sellers, and also those involved in transportation. So a lot of actors in the industry along the very long food chain. So compliance means conforming to a rule, to the policy, to a standard, or to a law. But there are so many potential determinants of compliance among the producers. So they have many considerations and many factors that affect their compliance behavior, including abilities, such as cost or knowledge level. And they also receive some social pressure. And they have their own attitude towards food safety. So all these factors actually affect their compliance behavior. So for different determinants of compliance motivation, the government have to formulate different strategy to make sure that they comply. So this is a very typical strategy here in this table. So in this table, you can see two dimensions. First, whether the producer, they are willing to comply. And the other dimension is that whether they have the knowledge about regulatory requirements. Because some producers, they actually do not know the requirements. So they do not have enough information to make sure that their activities comply with the law. So we have the well-intentioned and ill-intentioned people. We also have the well-informed and the low-informed people. So here, this one. So these are the people, they're the amoral calculators because they are well-informed. They know the standard, they know the requirement very well, but they are unwilling to comply. So they are the amoral calculator. So this type 2, they are well informed. They know the requirement, but they are also willing to comply. So they are the honest triers. So they are the best producer. They know the standard. They're well knowledgeable and they're willing. So they are the best. And the type 3 is the principled objectors. Okay, they're ill-informed. Okay, but they are unwilling to comply. Okay, they don't want to do anything. And the type 4 is the organizationally incompetent. Okay, so they are ill-informed, but they are willing to comply. Actually, they are quite good citizens. If they have the good information, actually, they are willing to comply. So these people willing to comply, they are the well-intentioned people, and these are the ill-intentioned people. So persuasion, just like what we mentioned just now, the persuasion measure actually are more appropriate for type 2 and type 4 because they are well-intentioned. So you can just persuade them, okay? And for type 1 and type 3, it's more appropriate to use the deterrence-based approach, just like imposing penalty on them, because they are not willing to comply. But then, wait, we have to think about persuasion versus deterrent. So if persuasion-based approach is better, but you will think about this persuasion might actually discourage attempts at improving performance. In other words, why should good performer bear more cost of higher regulatory compliance if poor compliance are not punished? So, which means if you are the big firm, you will think about, okay, if I comply, I will actually have to bear a higher production cost. But even the small producers, the small farmers, they do not comply. They will just receive persuasion. So it's not fair. So why should I comply? So this could be the adverse effect of using a persuasion-based approach. So in my another study, I also study the overuse practice of the farmers. So here, in this study, I measure overuse by the marginal productivity of pesticide, but not measured by the compliance with laws or standards. So I try to measure the marginal productivity and find out the overuse of pesticide which means, so, okay, we collect the data in China, so from the rice farmers, and we observe that each additional $1 of pesticide input actually just increased the rice production revenue by $0.39, which means it is not very productive. So it is overuse from the calculation of marginal productivity. So overuse, why overuse? Then we run the regression and we find out the result. So very interesting. The farmer, they have the knowledge about the standard here, and they have strong environmental concern here, and they are more likely to overuse pesticide. Okay, very interesting. And this also contradicts with our intuition. They have knowledge and they have environmental concern, but they overuse. Why? So we further study and we figure out that because these types of farmers, they tend to follow the instruction on the label of the box, on the box of the pesticide. And on the instruction, in the instruction, actually it prescribes an overdose in terms of marginal productivity. Of course, if you are the pesticide manufacturer, you also want the farmers to use more pesticide, and then you can earn more money. But actually, it doesn't mean that you will have the return for the farmers. So they overdose. So this is the phenomenon of loss aversion. So farmers, they have a greater fear of loss of income from pesticide underuse. Then the key adverse effects of overuse. So as a remedy, so we provide the policy suggestion is that maybe a pesticide test is proposed to enhance the farmer's sensitivity to the cost of pesticide input. Because now in China, for example, pesticide is very cheap. It's very, very cheap. So the farmer, they do not have a lot of sense when they overuse. But if the pesticide become more expensive, then they will try to think about that, and then they will be more likely to reduce their pesticide application. So another study, we tried to investigate into the motivation of compliance of farmers by using the theory of planned behavior. So this theory of planned behavior, there are many variables, many factors that affect the intention and hence the behavior of the farmer's behavior for compliance. So these factors include attitude, behavioral attitude, subjective norm, perceived behavioral control, and behavioral goal. So these factors, they affect the behavioral intention and hence the behavior of the farmers. So attitude here, attitude refers to the degree to which a person appreciates the behavior in question. So subjective norm is defined as the perceived social pressure to perform a pro-social behavior, like the family pressure or neighbor pressure. Perceived behavioral control refers to an individual's perception of his ability to perform that behavior. For example, the farmer will think about whether I have the capacity to comply with the law, whether I have the equipment, whether I have enough knowledge, whether I have enough money, for example, the production cost, to invest and then to comply. So these are the key factors that affect their intention. So according to theory, the more at the higher level of these factors, the more likely that they comply or they have the intention to comply. So in the study, I find that all these factors have the positive impact on the farmer's intention in complying with the standard. And perceived behavioral control was found to be the most influential factor, and subjective norm is the least, although it is still significant, but it's the least influential factor. Which means actually the subjective norm imposing on the farmer is not very enough. So we make the policy recommendation. It's like maybe we can think about a responsibility sharing program. which means farmers in the same area, they can join together to form a community, for example, and they have to share the responsibility with each other, and then they can foster a sense of control among the farmers. Of course, we need the government to help and help the farmers to form a responsibility sharing group. So they will then impose pressure on each other, and then they will monitor each other and then to change their behavior. So finally, I won't go further. So the regulatory space, just like what I mentioned just now, we have the regulator, we have the industry, but we still have many other participants, especially like consumers. So the consumers, they have different socioeconomic background, and they also have different concerns, different knowledge, different education level, different incomes. So their behavior actually affects the behavior of the producer. Imagine if you produce very good products, but no one buy, so why do you want to produce? So consumer is very important angle, but I'm not going to go deeper because I know our colleague Francisco, he will give a talk about consumer later, so I won't go deeper. But indeed, there are still many participants there. Scientists, of course, advocacy groups, media, health experts, victim group, trade associations, environmental groups, many others. So the regulatory space is overcrowded, so many participants with diverse interests. And in food safety regulation, there are so many stakeholders not covered today, but how can we formulate a policy which can balance different interests and concerns? So this is a very complicated issue from a policy analyst angle, very difficult. We think this policy is good in this sense, but actually they have some trade-off. They impose harm to another group. So how can we try to formulate a policy which can balance different groups measure? This is very difficult. So the summary is that given the very overcrowded regulatory space with multiple stakeholders, so when we formulate a policy, we have to be very careful. And global regulation is not enough, it's far from enough. So the global regulation is just the starting point, and we need the national governments to enforce or to change their legislation. And we also need the industry to self-regulate themselves. So regulation and self-regulation, there are two approaches that we have to choose from. And the risk of over-regulation is potentially greater than the risk of under-regulation. If you put too many too many regulation, actually you are giving harm to the industry and especially to the poor people, the poor farmer. So you have to think about the cost you are imposing on the very poor farmer. So over-regulation is also a problem. And bear in mind, very important, not every public policy problem should be or could be solved with legislation or government action. Actually, there are many other solutions. So policymakers should identify and use the best, most innovative, and least burdensome tools for achieving their regulatory ends. So to end, let's go back to this story. So my answer is that the two jurisdictions, Shenzhen city and the Dongguan city, the two jurisdictions, they need collaboration or collaborative actions for enforcement. So two police force, they have to stand in the same point. And when the illegal driver go from this jurisdiction to another, and the other police can catch them. Okay, so this is the, okay, it seems like a very good solution, right? But there are obstacles, and that's why they didn't do it 10 years ago, or maybe until now, they didn't do it. Because Shenzhen city is a very prosperous city, very rich. And Guangdong city is much less well off. Shenzhen now ranked today in 2020, Shenzhen ranked first among all the Chinese cities in terms of GDP. And Beijing is only number 7, and Shanghai is only number 8. And Shenzhen is the first, is the most high, with the highest GDP in whole China, very rich. But Guangdong is not that rich. So they do not share the same policy goal and priority. Shenzhen, they don't care about economic development. So they care more about safety, road safety. But Dongguan, they are not that rich. Okay, so the drivers, they need to survive. The illegal driver, they need to survive. And also the consumer, they treasure the chance of having the cheaper form of transportation instead of the legal taxi. So the two governments, they do not share the same policy goal and priority. So what motivates them to work together? So they don't have any motivation to work together. Even there are supports and mandates from the higher levels of government, like the Guangdong provincial government, they have the mandate. The policy implementation rely on the street level officers, just like this, the street level. Even they do not comply, even they do not enforce, the Guangdong provincial government never know. So that's why the problem is still there. So it remains very challenging to solve this problem, and we need more policy innovations. So the same as global food risk problem. Not all countries, they share the same goal and the priority of food safety. In some countries, they still cannot survive. People are so poor, they still do not share the same goal. So that's why not necessarily collaborative action can solve the problem, because some countries, they do not want to collaborate. So this finally gives an answer to my very first short story. So I think this is the end of my presentation. So if you have any questions, you can ask in the Q&A section, or you can also write me an email here. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, May. Well, I think this talk series is not just limited to technical issues or science, because in order to really develop agriculture to help the farmers or the people to increase income, there are multiple dimensions that we need to consider. So technology is one science and technology, but also how the industry work. But the industry will be under regulations. So like what May has presented today, so how the local government, the global regulators, and self-intention to be regulated, or some professional body, etc., will be very important to shape the agricultural business. So in China, and also probably in most of those developing countries. So I guess May's talk has given us some directions to go after, to have more deep thoughts about that, how to really improve the food industry by using the right kinds of agricultural product under the proper regulation. Okay, so now let me ask the favor from everybody, because it is difficult for us to see each other now. So could you just take off your mask so that we can take a picture together? I think my assistants will have to take a picture. Well, I see Matthew from Holland, right? Hi, long time no see, right?
Hello.
So,
hello to everyone.
Yeah, I will invite you to give a talk later next year, right? So, so everybody, please take off your mask, and who is going to take picture for us? I can, right? So when you're ready, after taking picture, let us know so that we can have a few minutes for Q&A.
I cannot see who's taking picture.
So
maybe we say 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay. One more. 1, 2, 3. Okay,
Done?
done.
Okay, so I think we have, since everybody's here, so I will still want to have some Q&A because we can have the answer directly from May now. So who would like to ask a question? So we have friends from different regions of the world, right? So please feel free to ask question.
Ming, I have one.
Yes, please, Michiel.
Okay. Well, my name is Michiel van Eyck. I'm CEO of Gene Twister, a biotechnology company in the Netherlands. First of all, I would like to compliment you for a very clear presentation. I'm a scientist by nature, and I'm not familiar with the topic of regulation so much, but I'm an honest trier, I believe.
Good.
My question is, what, in your opinion, are the most successful incentives to stimulate compliance with regulatory requirements? Because positive stimulation, in my experience, is always what, helps people to comply, I guess. So how does it work in this field?
Yeah, thank you. That depends on different types of producers. Just like my findings that, okay, the small producers, the best strategy is to persuade them because they actually, or even you have to help them because the small producers, they actually do not have the technology level, knowledge level. So you actually need to help them. So you have to, like, for example, you have to recommend the farmers, okay, use this brand of pesticide, use this fertilizer, they are better. So you actually have to help them. So the mindset is not, you are not going to penalize them. But for some producers, they are really, really bad. I've observed some producers, they do not have the good intention to comply. And I think penalty can be a very good strategy to them. But of course, you have to think about the dynamic. Because if you are the producer, you are receiving the penalty. You will think, okay, why my neighbor there, they are actually just having persuasion or having some even help, but not penalty. So it's not very fair. So when we talk about regulation or laws, we also emphasize the fair treatment among all the regulated business. So this is also the dilemma.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
So
Any other questions from the audience?
This is Joanna. I just have a quick question for your comment. Actually, I understand for regulation, usually there are mandatory ones and persuasive ones, because mandatory are very critical issues that, involves really heavily safety and, health of the consumers or whatever. So what should be under mandatory and what should be suggestive or persuasive? How do you define that in your view?
yeah, thank you, Joanna. Yes, right. For the very acute harm imposing on public health, so they are having a lot of mandatory standards, and there are some voluntary standards, just like to improve the flavor, like that. They are not the mandatory; they're the voluntary one. But what I want to say is that, okay, standards are there, but it doesn't mean that the local enforcer, they will just treat all the regulators equally. Even the same standard about very important health safety problem. Even the enforcer, they know that they are using the illegal pesticide, which will kill people, but they will still think about maybe give him another chance again because they are living under poverty. So in the rural China, many farmers, they are not having enough like income. So the enforcer, they will think about that. They will, so that's why we have the enforcement gap. So this gap is not a intentioned gap. So the central governments, they actually do not want to have this gap. They want to close this gap. But if for the enforcer, the frontline enforcer, they will consider some circumstances, the context of enforcement, like the GDP concern, the social stability, even though they know this farmer, they are imposing very, very important risk to society, they will just still let them go and use the persuasive form. And you know, when I was in the farm, I saw the farmer. When they farm, they divide their land into 2 parts. And this part is for our own consumption, for my own family. I don't put any pesticide or any chemical in it. And this part of the land is for sale. So I put a lot of chemicals. And the regulators, they know it. Of course, they know, but they will still think, okay, because the family is too poor, so I will just let them just sell the illegal or the product which is not safe. And they also think that because that product, they would not circulate in the large area in the country. They just circulate in the neighbors. So the risk imposed on the society can be minimal. So they will think that, okay, will just let them just survive first. So I don't see, I cannot answer like which one is the best strategy. So I just try to emphasize that enforcement is far from like what we think, because the enforcer, they have their own autonomy, or not autonomy, but discretion when they enforce the law. And that actually the policymaker, they cannot control the frontline inspectors. Yeah, and this is the thing that we also need to feel actually.
Thank you. So, did any question from our friends from South Africa? I can see Deco's back. So he just get down from the plane, right? So I'm glad that you make it. So okay. So if there's no urgent question, so let me do a advertisement before we end it. So, Joanna, could you please post the next poster? Okay, so actually, Dr. Anthony's chair was here some time ago in the Zoom meeting. Well, the next talk will be in January next year. So we'll be talking about the seed quality and international seed trade. So Dr. Anthony Chair is actually a business person who do international seed trade, especially they are producing seeds in China and selling it to different parts of the world. And he has been the Asian Seed Society chairman for some time. So I believe that his business expertise could help us to understand how important the seed qualities is to agriculture. And if we want to do trading of seeds, if some agricultural product needs to become an international agricultural product, how could we do it? And what are the principles behind all this? So I hope that you can mark your calendar and try to join us in January. And the time is still 7 p.m. in Hong Kong. And because I try to accommodate as many people as possible in the world, so the timing could be quite different from one time zone to the other. Okay, so I hope that everybody can enjoy the talk today, and looking forward to listen to Dr. Anthony Chair's talk in January. Okay, so good night or good morning, whatever, to to everyone. Okay, bye bye. We'll see you later. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.